Who controls Mexico? About 15 people have died in this country of overdoses, mostly fentanyl, since this hearing started.
Ghost fleet vessels.
Is Venezuela freely sharing their criminal records with us?
I don't know exactly if Venezuela is sharing specific information with us.
The second category.
Just, I recognize people feel passionately that the American people deserve to hear from the leaders of the intelligence community.
It's an agent of a foreign power involved. So I think that's part of the problem that we have.
If the witness will pause for a moment.
All other actors have said an immediate and permanent ceasefire will lead to a cessation of any...
And the proof will be in the pudding. Welcome to our witnesses. Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, CIA Director Bill Burns, FBI Director Wray, Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research at the State Department, Brett Holmgren, Director of National Security Agency, General Timothy Haugh, and Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA Director, Lieutenant General Jeffrey Kruse.
Today, the United States faces an increasingly complex and interconnected threat, as has been noted by the Chairman and Vice Chairman, environment characterized by really three categories of challenges. The first is an accelerating strategic competition with major authoritarian powers that are actively working to undermine the rules-based order and the open international system the United States and our partners rely on for trade, commerce, the free flow of information, and accountability to the truth. The second category.
Just, I recognize people feel passionately that the American people deserve to hear from the leaders of the intelligence community. Director Haines, continue.
Okay. The second category is a set of more intense and unpredictable transnational challenges, such as climate change, corruption, narcotics trafficking, health security, terrorism, and cybercrime that often interact with traditional state-based political, economic, and security challenges. And the third category is regional and localized conflicts that have far-reaching and at times cascading implications, not only for neighboring countries, but also for the world.
Director Wray, I want to start my question, though, with you. Some have actually said, though, that where we went didn't go far enough, and they would propose a reform that would require agencies to seek a warrant before conducting U.S. person queries. Could you explain what would happen on a practical level, both from the IC side and the law enforcement side, if that requirement was put in place?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the short answer is that a warrant requirement for us to run U.S. person queries would be untenable and would largely gut the effectiveness of the authority. And I say that for several reasons. First, it would blind us to information already lawfully in our possession that we need to be able to review and act on in a very time-sensitive way to be able to stop terrorist attacks, protect a victim from a cyber attack, warn somebody who is potentially targeted with assassination or kidnapping. Second, in many instances, at the time that the query would be run, we wouldn't have the probable cause that the query term is associated with an agent of a foreign power. That's what the query tells us. And so you got that problem. And then the third problem is that an awful lot of the places that we're using 702 queries are to assist victims and to prevent potential victims from further attacks, whether terrorist attacks, cyber attacks, et cetera. And so in those instances, you'd never be able to get a warrant requirement. Even if there were some kind of delay built into it, that alone, for all these threats, which are extremely time sensitive, I think that the DNI correctly used the term agility. That is the key. And so I would implore Congress not to take that additional step. You mentioned the compliance failures. I've been very clear that the compliance failures that occurred at the FBI are wholly unacceptable, and that's why I put in place a whole host of reforms, which are covering everything from training to our systems, approvals, oversight, an Office of Internal Audit. I could go on, and those reforms are working. The FISA court itself most recently found 98% compliance and commented on the reforms working. The most recent Justice Department report found the reforms working, 99% compliance. And so I think legislation that ensures those reforms stay in place, but also preserves the agility and the utility of the tools, what we need to be able to protect the American people.
Have members or people with ties to dangerous gangs, like, for example, the prison gang Tren de Aragua from Venezuela, were they among the people that came into this country?
I don't know that I can speak to the specific gang, but certainly we have had dangerous individuals enter the United States of a variety of sorts.
Are we seeing crimes from people that entered the country over the last 3 years, some of them with ties to gangs or other criminal organizations?
Well, I guess what I would say is this. From an FBI perspective, we are seeing a wide array of very dangerous threats that emanate from the border, and that includes everything from the drug trafficking. The FBI alone seized enough fentanyl in the last 2 years to kill 270 million people. That's just on the fentanyl side. An awful lot of the violent crime in the United States is at the hands of gangs who are themselves involved in the distribution of that fentanyl.
But you're also seeing and tracking local law enforcement arresting and for example, the assault on the police officers in New York. All the reporting said they had ties to this gang in particular, but there's no doubt that people that were criminals in their country of origin have crossed that border and are now in the U.S. committing crimes.
Correct.
Is there now a black market emerging to sell? We've seen reports of a black market emerging selling fake Social Security cards, fake green cards. Have you seen reporting on that?
Well, certainly there is on the darknet, for example, there is a significant marketplace for different kinds of stolen identity.
What about in the street?
I think as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Are there any constitutional or statutory limits on your agency's purchasing of the location information of Americans? Constitutional or statutory limits, any?
Thank you for the question, Senator Wyden. I would say yes, there are absolute and very clear guidelines for all of us. And when we purchase the bulk data, the first thing we do is we exclude all of the data that is within U.S. territory and is on U.S. citizens as the very first step. Our teams have been here with the Congress talking through our Attorney General guidelines, have been speaking with the concerns that you and others have voiced to us. And I think we have built the processes around our purchasing of commercial data and use of commercial data in partnership with you.
I didn't hear you mention what I asked about, either constitutional or statutory limits. So why don't you just send that to us for the record? And I will just say, colleagues, this is the reason why Congress needs to pass legislation limiting government purchases of Americans' information. Doesn't our warrant requirement only apply to a tiny fraction of the searches the FBI conducts when you factor in all of these exceptions? I mean, I can go through them, but I think you know them. You know, if there's any imminent danger, no warrant. If there are other dangers, you have to go get the warrant later. But the exception list is very long. So the question is, isn't it correct that what we're talking about in the bipartisan bill here in the Senate and in the House, it would apply to only a small fraction of the searches you're conducting?
Well, well, as a percentage, it's not a significant percentage. Certainly the number is significant, and I think the fundamental problem with the warrant requirement before you can look at the content is that it's the content that tells us whether or not it's an agent of a foreign power involved. So I think that's part of the problem that we have.
If the witness will pause for a moment.
All other actors have said an immediate and permanent ceasefire will lead to a cessation of any threat. Israel is the biggest threat.
Continue.
I think where I got cut off was I was just explaining that the fundamental problem is that in the instances where we need to look at the content, the probable cause that's lacking at that point is what's established by seeing the content. That's what tells us more often than not that there's an agent of a foreign power involved. And so that's what enables us to then act and go forward with the appropriate investigative steps.
So there's an exception for imminent danger. There's an exception for in other emergencies. There is an exception to simply conversations with foreign threats. I'd like you to send to me, so we'll have this for the record, how having those exceptions will in some way obstruct you when you're trying to deal with a tiny number of warrants. This is all about Americans believing, you bet we have foreign threats. There's no question about it. But we can address those foreign threats in a way that's compatible with the liberty and the values that law-abiding Americans hold.
I would like you to comment on whether or not terrorist groups backed by Iran, such as Hamas and Hezbollah, pose a threat to our homeland.
Thank you, Senator. So in terms of the threat from ISIS, which you're absolutely right, remains a significant counterterrorism concern for us. Most of the attacks that you're talking about globally taken on by ISIS have actually occurred by parts of ISIS that are outside of Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, there still remains an ISIS concern. It has one where, ironically, the Taliban has actually also concerned about it because the ISIS group that is in Afghanistan is, in fact, going after the Taliban. And so this is a place where actually the Taliban has taken action against that group in ways that are consistent with our also concerns and interests. So that is one piece. In terms of the terrorist groups that are backed by Iran, absolutely, that is a major issue for us.
Why do you think the Chinese have sent their citizens to rural America to establish these illegal growing operations?
Well, certainly we're observing the same phenomenon that you're describing. I know we've had a number of cases that have resulted in indictments of Chinese nationals involved with illegal marijuana grow operations here and otherwise involved in different kinds of organized criminal activity. We are tackling that through working with our state and local law enforcement partners through a variety of task forces. We're trying to share intelligence with them to help get ahead of the threat. I'm not sure that I could give you a reason as to why it's happening.
I just returned from my 10th visit to Ukraine during the course of the war, and I left convinced that we're at a profoundly important crossroads for Ukraine, for European security, and for long-term American interests around the world. I think down one road with supplemental assistance approved by the Congress lies the very real possibility of cementing a strategic success for Ukraine and a strategic loss for Vladimir Putin's Russia. It's our assessment that with supplemental assistance, Ukraine can hold its own on the front lines through 2024 and into early 2025, that Ukraine can continue to exact costs against Russia, not only with deep penetration strikes in Crimea, but also against Russia's Black Sea Fleet, continuing the success which has resulted in 15 Russian ships sunk over the course of the last 6 months. In other words, with supplemental assistance, Ukraine can put itself in a position by the end of 2024, the beginning of 2025, where it could regain the offensive initiative and also put itself in a position to negotiate from a position of greater strength and achieve an outcome in which Putin's goal, which was to subjugate Ukraine and to control its choices, would be denied, where Ukraine could sustain itself as a strong, sovereign, independent country, anchor itself in Western institutions, and have the space and the security to recover from this terrible aggression and leave Russia to deal with the long-term consequences of Putin's brutal and foolish invasion. Down another road, however, without supplemental assistance, it seems to me, lies a much grimmer future. Ukraine is likely to lose ground, and probably significant ground, in 2024. I saw, in the Battle of Avdiivka, which forced a rushed withdrawal of Ukrainian forces just a couple of days before I was in Kyiv on this last visit, the consequences of that. One senior Ukrainian partner described what happened to me. He said that, our men fought as long and as hard as they could. We ran out of ammunition, and the Russians just kept coming. And I think without supplemental assistance in 2024, you're going to see more Avdiivkas. And that, it seems to me, would be a massive and historic mistake for the United States.
What lesson do you think the CCP will take from that?
I think the consequence of that will not just be for Ukraine or European security.
Israel is exterminating the Palestinian people. Children are being starved to death. Don't support the extermination of Palestinian people. Stop sending arms to Israel. Stop supporting the starvation of children. Children are being starved to death today.
I think
Witness will continue.
Sure. No, I think the consequences of that are going to be felt not only by Ukrainians and in European security, but across the Indo-Pacific, where if we're seen to be walking away from support for Ukraine, not only is that going to feed doubts amongst our allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, it's going to stoke the ambitions of the Chinese leadership in contingencies ranging from Taiwan to the South China Sea. So that's what I saw on this last visit. That's what I think's at stake for all of us. I think the truth is that the Ukrainians are not running out of courage and tenacity. They're running out of ammunition, and we're running out of time to help them.
So it's your assessment, the intelligence community assessments, that Tehran has orchestrated attacks on Israel and against U.S. personnel and positions in the Middle East since October 7th?
Yes, and I don't think that means that that the proxy groups or that others are always listening to everything that they have to say or under their direct control. But I think orchestrating is an appropriate characterization of what they've looked to do.
So it has, to use the dictionary definition, arranged or directed the elements of a situation to produce a desired effect, especially surreptitiously. That's correct? Okay. Director Burns, on page 34 of the assessment, the IC notes that the FBI and the Department of Energy have concluded that the most likely origins for the coronavirus pandemic was a laboratory in Wuhan, but the CIA cannot agree with that conclusively. Why can't the CIA reach the same conclusion that the FBI and the Department of Energy have reached?
Yeah, no, our analysts continue to look at this very carefully. They have not yet concluded that there's definitive evidence on either side of this, whether natural transmission or a lab accident. Well, we continue to pursue, more intelligence, more information that might help them to reach a definitive conclusion. But right now, they haven't been able to reach that.
Director Wray, why are your analysts so much more competent?
Our analysts did very rigorous work involving a whole slew of experts of different sorts. We reached the assessment with moderate confidence, and we stand by that assessment.
Who controls Mexico? Is the government of Mexico in control, or are the cartels in control? And how do we get at the problem of the drugs, the fentanyl? By the way, I did a little calculation a minute ago. About 15 people have died in this country of overdoses, mostly fentanyl, since this hearing started an hour and 20 minutes ago. That's how serious this problem. One a day in my state of Maine. How do we get control of this problem?
I'll start, because there are a lot of us, obviously, that are working to help support those who are on the front lines of this, which include the FBI, obviously, and DEA and DHS and others who are really focused on this question. But on the first point, Senator King, with respect to Mexico, I think there's no question that it is a challenge for the government of Mexico to deal with the cartels, and there are parts of the country that are effectively under the control of the cartels in certain respects. And yet, at the same time, I would say that our cooperation with them has improved over time, and I think Director Burns and Director Wray may have more to say on this, but this is an area where we've really been able to work with them to try to help to.
Obviously,
yeah.
We have been able to work, and it's improving, but this is a drastic problem that should be treated as such in terms of the impact on Americans.
Yeah.
maybe this is a DHS question, but Director Wray, do we know how fentanyl is actually getting in? Where is it coming?
You mean coming, well,
Yeah, how does it get into the U.S.?
it's coming through a variety of means, including at ports of entry, but there's a variety of ways it gets in. The part of the challenge of fentanyl is, of course, how small it is and how easy it is to conceal and how easy it is to be innovative in ways to get it across the border. The vast majority of the fentanyl that's killing Americans is, of course, coming from Mexico, and the vast majority of the precursors for that fentanyl is coming from China.
And so one of those tools that really assist in this type of scenario is Section 702 and our ability, because by its very nature, if there's an origin of that threat, that there's a foreign entity communicating within the United States with a communications provider, it offers us an opportunity under Section 702 to target that foreign intelligence threat outside the United States. And so with the reauthorization of Section 702, that would ensure one means by which we are able to see the foreign part of that communication.
Thank you.
Can you tell the American people with any certainty that there are 0 people on the terrorist watch list that were among that 1.8 million gotaways?
Well, what I would say is I think, rightly highlighted the kind of what you remember Secretary Rumsfeld used to refer to the known known, the known unknown, and the unknown unknown. And I think here, in many ways, the national security ramifications of the issues at the border are better reflected in some ways more by what we don't know about the people who snuck in, provided fake documents, or in some other way got in when there wasn't sufficient information available at the time they came in to connect the dots is almost more significant in our view than the actual number of so-called KSTs, because those people, for the most part, are stopped, detained, and processed appropriately.
It's our assessment that Russia is not serious about negotiations today, in the sense that they may be interested in the theater of negotiations, but they're not really interested in negotiating in the sense of compromise right now. Because, as Director Haynes said in her opening remarks, I think President Putin believes that time is on his side, that he can grind down the Ukrainians and wear down the rest of us. So if you look at the prospect of a more serious negotiation in the future, it's essential for Ukraine, first with our support, to disabuse the Russian leadership of the notion. In other words, to puncture his confidence that time's on his side, to demonstrate that for Russia also there are long-term consequences to this war. They've already suffered enormously in terms of their military, 315,000 plus dead and wounded, 4 times the casualties that the Soviet Union suffered in a decade of war in Afghanistan, the destruction of something on the order of 2/3 of their pre-war tank inventory, and long-term economic consequences, which, is fast making Russia the economic vassal of China. Not to mention a much stronger and bigger NATO that they have to face today. So the challenge in 2024 is helping the Ukrainians not just to hold their own, but to continue to impose costs so that they'd be in a position of greater strength, greater leverage in a negotiation. And I think that would be my answer to that question. If you want to get to a serious negotiation, you have to help the Ukrainians demonstrate that Putin's wrong in his notion that time is on his side.
General Kruse, how do you assess the current balance of military power between in the Pacific today, the United States and China and others?
I think I would describe the balance of power today as China is on a rise, that it has been planning for multiple 5-year periods, and it has executed that development, that training, that exercising in a way that has put them in a position that at some point in the not too distant future, in accordance with Xi's own goals, they will be a world-leading military power. The United States, though, is the world's leading military power today, and so the imperative piece for us is to be on that same trajectory to match them stride for stride and ensure we stay ahead of the growth that we see in China. But there is no doubt the growth that you see and has been discussed today in military power associated with China and the rise in all domains, cyberspace as well as conventional.
How is the intelligence community supporting the administration's efforts to impose further costs on Iran including by focusing on identifying and sanctioning so-called ghost fleet vessels carrying Iranian oil and Chinese refineries purchasing Iranian oil?
Thank you, Senator. Yeah, I mean, we're very involved is the short answer, but the longer answer, and we actually do periodic reports to Congress that tell you about some of the work that we do in this area where we're identifying where we see sanctions evasion, where we see opportunities for essentially additional targets for sanctions that might be acted on, you know, that are sort of third parties or others who are involved in these transactions so that the Treasury Department and others can, in fact, go after them in that respect. And it's a constant and critical issue.
Is Venezuela freely sharing their criminal records with us? Do we know if these individuals have a criminal record?
Thank you, Senator. I don't know exactly if Venezuela is sharing specific information with us. What I can say, though, about Venezuela, obviously, is that we've seen over 7 million Venezuelans emigrate from the country since 2017, a significant portion of whom obviously have emigrated to the United States illegally. But when we do get relevant information from our counterparts at DHS and FBI, our analysts use that to help inform their judgments.
It's one of the challenges that we have as well for individuals. For instance, currently Nicaragua is not taking people back on that, and we're all dependent on State Department to impose some sort of consequences on Nicaragua to say you're a recalcitrant country, you're not taking people back on that. Do you happen to know any of the conversation right now between Nicaragua and the United States on trying to deal with recalcitrants? Because we do have a tracking of some that have criminal records that are coming towards us, and to consider that a threat.
Senator, I don't have specifics on the details of engagement with Nicaragua. Happy to follow up with you offline.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Have any of you seen foreign adversaries with intent to use generative AI, either images, videos, audio, to deceive American voters? What are we relying on to advise the public when this inauthentic content appears? Director Wray, you can start.
Well, I want to think about what I could say here. I mean, certainly AI is something that all of our most significant adversaries are taking a hard look at to enhance their efforts. We have seen AI used in a variety of settings, whether it's been used specifically to target voters. I'm not sure that I could say that, but we are actively concerned about that as the latest wrinkle in a long-standing effort to engage in information warfare.
Director Burns.
Yeah, I mean, another example is we've seen evidence that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has used AI to generate videos aimed at inspiring lone wolf attacks as a result of the Gaza conflict as well.
Director Haynes.
Yeah, I think another example is Russia deploying AI tools in the context of their influence efforts in Ukraine. And there we've seen, for example, I think it was in March 2022, there was a deep fake of the Ukrainian president, Zelensky, asking Ukrainians to lay down their arms, and ultimately had to be actually countered by President Zelensky in order to address it.
Did we give them the information or capability to do that quickly?
The Ukrainians? Yes, we worked with them on that.
General Haugh.
So in terms of how we're thinking about AI security, NSA established an AI security center. Part of that is to be able to generate and communicate to anyone that is building a model in the United States from an AI perspective, what are those threats? And what are the security mechanisms to ensure to avoid misuse of those models? We're also using the AI Security Center for how we apply all of the ethical and safety standards of how the department will leverage AI, but really the last component would be how do we communicate to those companies the threats that they will have of their technology and how it will be employed.
So, go ahead.
Sure, Senator, quickly, you're right to raise this as a threat, and I think our view of it is that tools like generative AI will essentially lower the barrier for actors, state and non-state, with fewer resources to engage in potential election interference.
And General Kruse?
From a DIA perspective, I don't think I would add anything to what has been covered here other than the counterintelligence portion of that has a touch point across everything that's already been mentioned.
I would indicate, Senator Gentleman, at the Munich Security Conference, something I participated in, there were 20 tech companies that came together, most of the social media companies, on a voluntary basis to indicate both watermarking and willingness to take down AI-generated video and voice that were affecting elections, but it was voluntary, and the proof will be in the pudding.
Just curious about whether or not you are aware or could confirm land purchases by Chinese nationalists within the United States, and are you following them at this time?
So this is an issue that we're focused on a lot lately. I think what I would say is we're investigating a number of instances proactively where we're seeing either commercial real estate or land being purchased by those with ties to the PRC near critical infrastructure. And I want to be clear, of course, foreign purchase of land, including Chinese purchase of land, is not itself inherently illegal. The problem is the risk, and as has been discussed much here already in a different context, the hold that the Chinese government and the CCP have over its businesses in particular. And so we're particularly concerned about situations where a purchase of land near a military installation, critical infrastructure, something like that, could be leveraged to enable anything from espionage, data collection, or worse.
Do you share my view that the threat of terrorism associated with unlawful entry through the southern border poses a serious threat to U.S. national security?
Yes, I've testified repeatedly that we are concerned about the terrorism implications from potential targeting of vulnerabilities at the border.
How would you assess the present level of threat and risk of a terrorist attack in the United States compared to past periods during your tenure?
Well, even before October 7th, I would have told this committee that we were at a heightened threat level from a terrorism perspective, in the sense that it's the first time I've seen in a long, long time the threats from homegrown violent extremists, that is jihadist-inspired extremists, domestic violent extremists, foreign terrorist organizations, and state-sponsored terrorist organizations all being elevated at one time. Since October 7th, though, that threat has gone to a whole nother level. And so this is a time, I think, for much greater vigilance than has maybe been called upon of us before October 7th.
So I'd like to ask you, Director Haynes, how do our adversaries view the impact of political extremism and polarization and partisanship on America's strength and stability? We're talking about worldwide threats. Those threats can exploit our own frailties here at home.
I think the best way I can answer that question is to point to the fact that we've seen that both Russia and China, for example, have taken the opportunity to highlight where there's political dysfunction or other issues that they see in the context of our governance, and use it as part of their information operations globally, both to sort of highlight, for example, to their own populations that, you know, democracy is quite challenging and would you really want this at home kind of thing, and also to demonstrate to our allies and partners that maybe we can't be relied on as effectively.
We are adjourned until we move into the classified setting.